Okay, we are back. Dos Zekis K Voy. I am Objet A Simpson, joined today by who am I joined today by?
Al Gore.
Just
we're
Al
here to
Gore
we're here to
back.
discuss Man Bear Pig.
He's super serial about phenomenology, y'all.
Yeah.
That's right. You're talking to the boys with the perfect physiognomy. Heads no. And today we are going to be discussing seminar 2 of one of the not so minor figures in the history of psychoanalysis, Mr. Jacques Lacan.
Jacques Lacan. Which apparently there is a shampoo company named Lacan that their products are distributed in Brazil. So pretty interesting.
That's right. Oh, it's not lotion, it's shampoo.
I think that there's also a lotion as well. It's the same product though.
Okay, all
Yeah.
types of Lacanian unguents,
Yep.
you know, to keep your dust ding happy.
That's probably
I
why you have
couldn't think
such
of
good hair.
anything.
Like it's better than lethal, man. Like you just use that shampoo.
He did have good shampooed hair. Jesus, what am I talking about? Yeah, that's right. This is the Das Ding dynasty
Yeah.
over here. Today we're going to be talking about the symbolic universe.
Mhm.
Andrew, what are your opinions on the symbolic universe? Yay?
Yeah.
Totally yay, says Andrew. I'm more about the symbolic multiverse ever since I became an Elon Musk bro. That happened yesterday. I saw enough inspirational Facebook memes, quotes by him to effectively be converted away from theory and towards the success grind set mindset of a one Mr. Musk. So
Right.
sorry, but I gotta bow out.
You
Anyway,
know, you're I robot shit. You're like you're trying to become machinic, machinic unconscious, like DNG. It's like taking it to a new level. But you got the metaverse. It's not even the multiverse now.
oh right, yes. So our avatars on the metaverse right now are doing a similar podcast, but it's about the philosophy of a one Mr. Gary V.
Right. Yeah.
And they watch all of his videos and comment on them, and it's like a line reading of his. They have transcripts of every video he ever came out with, and it's like a line reading of Gary V's inspirational content. So check that
Yeah.
out on the metaverse. We look much better.
where we describe the philosophy of how being poor is a better privilege than being rich. Being born into
Yes, yes, rich people are so miserable with all their wealth, and poor people, it's like you got something to aim for. You got a carrot dangling in front of you, and that just keeps your legs moving, your limbs working, and hey, you could work your way to the top. It happened to Jay-Z. That's one guy, so it's going to happen to you too. um all right, we're
so,
off topic here. So
so what's the deal with Levi Strauss though? We talking about Levi's? We talking about Levi Strauss, the jeans?
now, is it Strauss, or I was calling him Strauss for the longest time, and then I've heard people just say Strau. I
Strauss?
don't know.
No, we don't pronounce the
We
S.
don't we don't care about pronouncing things correctly over here. We try to mispronounce
Yeah.
when
So
possible.
anyway, yeah, we
But
got
I don't know if it's Strauss, Strau, Levi's, Dockers. There's let's see. Levi Strauss, of course, was a good friend of Lacan and
right.
influenced a lot of his earlier theories. And in this chapter in particular, they the attendees highlight that fact, and because they're like fresh off the heels of a talk by Levi Strauss on, I don't know, I guess moieties,
Yes.
exogamy, endogamy, all that good stuff.
Right. Right. It's from his work, the elements of elementary structures of kinship. But like, yeah, he's specifically like going over certain topics about the kinship, exonomy, endogamy, or whatever it is. But like the difference of kinship and the family.
Right. So I'm definitely no expert. I tried to read some, like a survey on Levi Strauss earlier this year, and I was completely lost because it is granular to an insane degree.
Right.
Really unbelievable the breadth of research that he did, but it's also quite boring. However,
Right.
much important it is to our understanding of anthropology. But I know we have your kinship systems, your alliances, your moieties and affines and everything. I think for the sake of understanding this chapter, the important thing to note is the difference between exogamy and endogamy, in
Right.
marrying outside one's clan or tribe,
Mhm.
or forming an alliance with another tribe is exogamy outside, where like endogamy would be marrying within the tribe.
Right. Right.
And that's
Most definitely.
something that's going to be brought up here, along with Levi Strauss' notion of the symbolic, the universal, versus what Lacan is calling the generic. And of course, the Oedipus complex, the incest taboo,
Hmm.
the light shed on the incest taboo by Levi Strauss,
Right. Right. Right.
which helped to back up some of Lacan's main ideas surrounding
Right.
the Oedipus complex, which always has a very dubious and controversial place in his system.
Yeah, and exactly. And like when Freud came up with totem and taboo, then like it became a huge controversy, not only in psychoanalysis, but like even anthropology trying to validate it or debunk it. So Levi Strauss was one of those heavy hitters in examining the incest taboo and other kinships, or tribes in his overall work. Also an avid reader of Maus as well. With I would say he's probably influential in establishing like some sort of not only kinship but like symbolic exchange in Levi Strauss's work, like looking for symbolic exchange, symbolic structuration in categories that structure the society, rather than it's like, well, it's all because of a social contract, and individual choices are made, like the way we would view things in like a liberal society, or like we think we presuppose everything, or in a sense it's like sociology bros are like, oh, it's just all about norms and values and social constructions. But to the extent, yes and no. The thing is like the main thing that I think the symbolic order has, in regards of what Levi Strauss was getting at, and then what Lacan will take up, is that like, the symbolic order is a machine that functions and kind of takes a life of its own, and in a sense, we are subjected to it, or to be Althusserian about it, we're interpolated.
That's a good term to introduce at this juncture.
Right.
Interpolation is sort of what constitutes subjectivity.
Mm-hmm.
And we're still at the level of full speech and the creative function of speech. And the subject now, I think, is going to begin to gradually take shape
Mm-hmm.
in the context of this creative function of speech. But right now, what Lacan seems to be doing is broadening his definition of the symbolic to include not simply signifiers. I mean, ultimately, it does all boil down to the interactivity between signifiers, but the symbolic order at this point, I think, is being introduced into the argument from the point of view of anthropology and maybe in a more common understanding of what the symbol is for the academy, let's say, hence bringing Levi Strauss in, because Lacan is always at pains to weave his theories together with the other disciplines and fields of study that were in vogue at the time. So he doesn't want psychoanalysis to exist in a sort of vacuum, I think.
Right.
And I believe that's one of the reasons he's making an effort to, as I mentioned before, sort of broaden this definition of the symbolic order. So it doesn't become what he would think of as idiotic, right? Idiocy in the sense of a sort of private, personal, idiosyncratic monologue with oneself,
Right.
which is not what psychoanalysis is. Psychoanalysis is meant to bring out the symbolic, at least now, at this point, before we get into Lacan of the real. We supposedly are at Lacan of the imaginary, but I mean, the symbolic is very prominent at this point. But I think that, you know, what we're witnessing at this point is this idea of like the symbolic self-interrogating almost. And that's what I see analysis as, where it's not so much the individual and their personal history that needs to be, as Zizek once put it, sort of organized into a coherent narrative, but rather the symbolic being fleshed out in its autonomy, pretty much independent of the story one has of themselves, and another name for the sort of like, you know, whirl of stories that one has about themselves is the ego.
Right. Exactly.
And
it's
that, of
always,
course, is an obstacle.
right. Because
It
the ego
is
loves structuring
resistant.
itself through speech. The ego loves, like, that's how it desires in the fantasy, right? Is, of course, the imaginary mirroring function, something. And then you have the symbolic order in which structures language and desire, but it's never like a coherency, right? Because it's always like hiding like the subject in question. Or at least the ego is always, misrecognizing itself. And, there's repression. So you never see like the symbol, as we talked about in seminar 1. And that's the one thing that you brought up, is like, yeah, the real is always there. And we could argue like, yeah, like, Lacan was in this imaginary phase, but like he's actually like grappling into terms with like these knots, these registers. And I think right here, what makes a big distinction compared to seminar 1 and towards the end, when we talk about like the level of speech and the symbol and the transference we have right here, it's an entire network of what the symbolic order would be. He won't say like at least signifiers, and he won't say master signifier like he'll say in seminar 3. But one thing that's interesting though is that we're talking about it in relation to anthropology. And one thing you can see is the symbolic order structuring under certain laws, classes, kinships, but mainly on enjoyment and prohibition, which is going to have significance for the ego. Like the superego is always going to say what is prohibited and what isn't. And then the certain gaps or spaces that allows for, transgression.
Well, that's really interesting, because I feel like when we're talking about these quote unquote primitive societies, which Lacan points out, are hardly unsophisticated.
Mhm. Yeah, and I
They
think
are
even
they
the
are
structures.
just the structures of these elementary structures are in many ways much more complex than what we encounter in our supposedly accomplished
Mhm.
form of family units and a society based on the individual. So at that level, the elementary level, the intricacy and the interwovenness of these different kinship systems is actually mind-bogglingly complex. The prohibitions that are involved, for instance, are also very complex. And what's really interesting is how it complicates a simplistic notion of the incest taboo is like, well, you can fuck whoever you want, but just not your mom, which is
Right.
kind of like what we think of it as. But the idea is that, and D&G talk about this, if you are prohibited from having sex with a family member, that prohibition, in a sense, is actually constitutive of their role. So
Mhm.
it's the fact that your brother or sister is off limits in that
Right.
regard that constitutes them as brother or sister. But in these other forms of these other kinship systems, it's much more complicated in that you know your uncle could be the authority figure, for
Yeah.
example, and
Right.
your uncle might not be your father's brother in the sense that the Western family
Yes.
composes these systems. So it gets very complicated. And the incest taboo isn't just about sex either. It's sort of, what is prohibited in general, what violates the symbolic order according to a law instructed network
Mhm.
of symbolic relations, which in many ways elude the individual. There's no one individual that even really grasps the entirety of this network. So there are a lot of enigmas and just problematics involved in trying to understand kinship systems. You could see how someone like Levi Strauss, I guess, was just following his own symptom or his own drive, became
Mhm.
insanely obsessed with kinship systems. And in fact, I think he said for one of his books, he read like literally 700 books or something just
Wow.
to research for one book. But this is off topic. I wanted to point out, I think this is really funny. We were talking about this earlier, how Lacan says, he warns everybody, a little caveat before beginning, you mustn't try to say elegant things aimed at putting you in the limelight and increasing the esteem in which you are already held. You're here to be receptive to things you haven't as yet seen and which are, in principle, unexpected. And then a little bit later, he says, the only criticism I have to make of you, if I may, is that you all want to appear too clever. Everybody
Yeah.
knows you are. So why do you want to appear as such? Does that remind you of anyone? Lacan himself?
Yeah.
I mean, who is he to tell
Right.
people that they shouldn't put themselves in the limelight when
Right. But I
obviously he's
think
like a real showboat of a
I
guy?
I think there's a transference in that though, like, especially with like people that he's engaged with, like who is it, Hippolyte, Manoni, and then I think the other dude that they have is Anzui, or Anzu, right? Is that how you pronounce it? Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
As
The
don't
other
go.
guy. But mainly it's like Noni and Hippolyte that are going to be his sublime hysterics in this one. But whenever he says it, it seems like, or like does these little quirks, it's like it kind of like boosts them up to kind of like, put him on the spotlight.
Right. We've been talking about this, how nothing Lacan ever says is purely random or by chance. I feel like it's always very meditated. And
Right.
lately we've been talking about how he did things to break transference
Right.
among his acolytes, and especially as his profile gained
Right.
over time and he became more and more of a celebrity. I think he found more and more ways to pretty much be a strategic asshole to like to undermine people's attachment to him.
But he was also really clever in provoking transference and like
Yes.
evoking it. Yeah.
Yeah. Look what we're doing right now.
And like this is pretty much like Carvett said that like he was a genius at evoking transference. It's like you either love him or you hate him, but that's a part of the like the transference. And it's like if you have like a transference love, then you get lost in this obscurity of trying to understand. And in some ways, it's like it with him, his writings evoke the discourse in you, and you end up in a sense kind of like in a situation of understanding the pathologies in which you hystericize a concept, right? Maybe not in the sense of like an actual like a pathology in which like an analysis treating, but like a certain clinical structure, I should say, of like put into philosophy of understanding what is this guy saying, because then you're projecting the object, oh, like this guy must have some truth that I'm inclined to discover,
Do you
right?
think the common dismissal, especially among Anglo-American academics, of Lacan as a charlatan is a feeble attempt to, in some ways, resist transference?
Right, yeah, I would say so.
Even then, though, they
Yeah.
fall into the spider's web.
Mm-hmm. Like it's the usual like, oh,
This
it's
guy
like he has
right
nothing good to
here.
say. Yeah, yep. Chomsky bros. You just got nothing to say. Oh, I think with my feet. My God, this guy is mad. It was then right there that he realized that French theory is full of cult of personalities.
He might have, if he didn't understand that joke, then about Lacan thinking with his feet, which, if you don't know, they met at one point, probably in the
He was giving
70s.
a discussion at MIT on language theory. Yeah,
Okay, right.
yeah.
Okay, and then
Chomsky was in the crowd and he asked, "Well, what is the nature of word? Oh, like what's the relationship between the nature of language and the mind, and to where or thought in the mind, and to where Lacan said, "Well, I think with my feet, not with my mind."
I think with my feet, and I think it was Peter Matthews who wrote Lacan the Charlatan, which I mean to read. I
Yeah.
want to read that, who was saying in an interview how that really freaked Chomsky out. And Chomsky was like, my God, this Frenchman is mad. And it's like, bro, you might have a little like Asperger's or something if you don't understand
Yeah,
jokes.
the humor.
And I've never heard Noam Chomsky ever tell a joke.
No, it's just very boring. Like
So you're
he's like,
not
if you need to
supposed
fall
to.
asleep,
Academics do not tell jokes. Must
the
be.
way he speaks now is like, oh, it's perfect, like white noise to go to sleep to.
I do kind of feel bad for him though, because he's like so old, but he still goes on every podcast. So I'll give him that. And it's like, yo, can you leave this man alone? Stop
Yeah, like
inviting
if
him on your podcast. He's like, he looks like a Shel Silverstein illustration or something at this point. Like, he's so fucking old. Leave him alone. He looks like if the earth came alive.
he's literally like
He's
just
done
giving the
his
most like
service.
moderate takes for like Gen Z moderates and wannabe leftists.
All right,
Wow.
we'll talk shit on him all day if we go down that
Yeah.
path. Although it looks like I'm a fan of him because I'm trying to like,
Yeah.
so it's our boy
Zizek's
over
telling him
there.
off.
So we don't know what Anzu Aziz Ansari here asked. This question is not reproduced here. Lost.
Yeah.
So, but it has something to do with the prohibition of incest,
Right, right.
Oedipus. complex. What do we want to say about this? The intensity of fantasy that we have discovered it to possess, the importance and presence that it has on the imaginary level.
Right. So like on the imaginary aspect, like and the way Mikey like explains in his video, we should probably drop a link for that because he has a video on the Oedipus complex, dangerous maybe. Like with the prohibition and the rivalry, right? We should see it as like you have it's not a matter of being in rivalry due to a prohibition from like your real father, the biological father. Rather, it's you have an imaginary, mirroring in rivalry for mastery towards something that is prohibiting you. And then you have the symbolic father, the Oedipus complex, which at least situates or structures the discourse for rules for such rivalry to begin with, if that makes sense. Like for instance, like you have like an imaginary father could be somebody like in fantasy, maybe in dreams or whatever. But then like the symbolic father, I think aligns more with like a law. So for instance, like in religion, and I think this is what like Freud was getting at with like his critique of religion and like Moses and monotheism. Of course, I mean he wouldn't say like the symbolic in the way Lacan would, but I think putting the registers in there, I think some like order structures these laws and prohibition for such rivalry in fantasy to exist.
So this conversation is going to segue into an exploration of the notion of universality, prohibition. Do you think that he is introducing the Oedipus complex at this point because it has this controversial sort of over application within psychoanalysis, and this of course is going to be what D&G famously or infamously try to pillory this notion of Oedipus as universal, but Lacan's already doing that in a sense.
Yeah,
because he immediately goes into this sort of digression about the word compensation for Tibetan and Nepalese tribes, where they kill little girls to even the quota of men versus women or something. And then it's like, it's kind of confusing at first, but
yeah, because I think like they can only have like certain for instance, certain like amount of women that could be available. And if there's like too much, then it unevens something. Or if you want to take over, I gotta answer the.
Sure, I'll try. You see, as soon as he leaves, I feel completely hamstrung. I think that Lacan doesn't want to linger on the notion of the Oedipus complex because it is so grounded in a Western mythos, possibly. And I know that like with D&G, right, they are criticizing this idea that the unconscious is a kind of theater, and the Oedipus complex doesn't help apparently for them, because it's like to Oedipize the unconscious is to make it the opposite of a machine. It's a stage, and that therein lies the counterproductive kind of rootedness in a Western mythos. But
right,
like we're saying, I feel like what Lacan's doing here is showing how the symbolic order doesn't need to be tied to a specific mythos. It doesn't need to be tied to a specific cast of characters or even a certain number of numerical elements. And it's not surprising to me that he talks about Jung's notion of the collective unconscious and why that doesn't really do the trick. And I'm sure you have a lot to say about
Yeah,
that.
and I think what like the thing is like about like the symbolic order is that it's all about like in a sense production. And when I read Anti-Oedipus and then I read chapter or this chapter, it really brought a lot of like D&G vibes with the way the symbolic order breaks down and how in this breaking down kind of reproduces new things, right? In a sense, there is this creative function, but it's not in like the collective unconscious where it's like this pure imaginary thing with elves and fairies, like not trying to like straw man Jung, but like for Jung, what the collective unconscious is like the unacknowledged or unaware, and sometimes it could be repressed too, but of some archaic, energies that we have, psychic energies of the past that are represented in like mythos and all this. But what Lacan is getting at is something of a sophistication of how you could say like a society operates. And for the level of myths and stuff like that, that seems to operate in symbolic order rather than myth creating a symbolic order, right? And I think that's what Jung confuses again, this notion of the creative imaginary aspect and the symbolic, the image and the symbolic or the symbol for the most part. One thing that's also interesting too that you mentioned, right, with D&G and their critique of Oedipus complex is that it isn't universal. And I think you're right. Like Lacan was already kind of ahead of that. And he wants to show that what Levi Strauss's discovery was this like working through the dichotomy of nature and culture and getting away from universality to a sort of contingency. And it's the fact of the contingency of a certain symbolic order that we live in that Oedipus complex arises, and you could say mask over what we call the natural. It wouldn't be, and there's never a naked, pure, natural world outside of the culture. It's like it's already going in and it's always changing.
Right. So here he mentions bees making pretty hexagons. Why do they make hexagons? Why are their hives made up of this shape? And he says, well, maybe it has something to do with the kind of pressure on the occupation of space that sort of requires that like that's the optimal shape, but it doesn't matter what shape it is. And it doesn't matter in a sense that you see endless hexagons in nature or endless shapes in nature. Later, he's going to talk about symmetries and asymmetries. We attribute or ascribe a kind of symbolic value to patterns and shapes, even if we try to step back and say, well, at the end of the day, nature is just nature. We can't help but see a kind of symbolic, almost teleology in the way signatures of nature, like he talks about signatura rerum, like the way they unfold supposedly for us. But I think this is where the subject comes into it. Now, I have my doubts if that's what he's getting at here, but I feel like he brings up these hexagons because they're not man-made, they're made by bees. And two, it is the level of the symbolic, or let's say the cultural and the natural, culture and nature alighting in some sense. From the perspective of trying to understand what bees are doing, basically.
Exactly. And it seems
if that
like
makes any sense. I don't know if that's clear at all, but
no, it's definitely bringing up a lot to what he'll say too about animals, because it's like it's not like, even them, they don't live in this like pure instinct type thing. It's like, the difference between animals is like, and man, all this like thing that other sciences do. And now he does make a distinction between like animals and humans multiple times, but it's a more niche understanding or a niche distinction in instincts, right? And I kind of lost my train of thought, but it came back to me. Like, I think the main thing is like criticizing this notion of evolution in the sense of like purely survival, right? And that there is some animals are immersed in some sort of sense in a symbolic order, and it could be also contingent to our inhabitants, right? In the symbolic, so they, in a sense, get interwoven there. But the fact of maybe the lures that they're in, like he says in Seminar 1, makes them what you would call a gen machine in their possibilities of developing, for instance, like language or something like that. Like if you look at like pets, right? Pets are totally a part of the symbolic order, right? But you don't see them having a language, but yet it's something interesting that you can't say like, oh, it's part of their DNA or something like genetic memory where they sit at the door, and wait for their owner to get home, right? Or they have like a way of like and it's not even like maybe even conditioning, but the fact is like how they have some form of communication. Like, are you tracking what I'm saying?
Absolutely. Yeah. No, that's really good because it's like
Yeah.
you
Not
can't you
not
can't
this naive
deny
Pavlovianism.
what?
It's not this naive Pavlovianism of just conditioning, right?
Right. And you can't deny to the animal kingdom the presence of a kind of signifiers. They do signify to each other in certain ways, but it's not quite, it's more signs that we're dealing with than signifiers proper, because this is what he talks about at the end of Seminar 1, which is when he's talking about Odysseus and his men being turned into pigs and how they want their grunts to be recognized as speech. When you
Right.
signify, you want what you're saying to be recognized as a signifier. Whereas these hexagons, for example, they signal something in terms of a sign, but they are not signifiers in that the bee doesn't want you to recognize the hexagon as a hexagon in a sense. Again, I don't know that I'm quite getting at what you're saying, and what you said gets
I think that was the
to the
point though,
heart
that
of the matter, but we're circling it.
there's like a point to where, and there is a sense of sort of communication, like the dog sitting there at the table barking that, oh, it's time for me to eat, because they usually eat at this time, right? Even if there was this sense of Pavlovian conditioning to it, the point is that there is still an immersion in some sort of order that allows for that to happen, right? A certain discourse.
Right.
Discourse is also the main function of symbolic structuration.
And one of my favorite ideas that I don't know where Lacan brings it up, but I'm excited to encounter it, is this idea that the signifier also can't be a signifier until you can recognize what someone's saying to you as signifying the opposite of what appears on the surface. So hence sarcasm, for example.
Right.
Someone who takes all language at face value is seen as what's the neuroatypical or something, right? Is that the phrase now? I don't know the PC way of saying it is, but like, because there isn't this libidinal background to what's being said, whereas within different symbolic orders based on varieties of prohibition, there's always a backdrop to language, and that's how the signifier emerges. And this is sort of the beyond of language, which the signifier points to, that Lacan always talks about. Whereas for animals, there's not, as far as we know, this beyond of language. They do have a language of their own, but maybe with the exception of certain monkeys who can joke.
Right. And I think, the main thing, the main thing is like they just don't have like, the distinction is like, they don't have a development of narcissism, like us. That's the main thing that we'll be getting at in these next two chapters.
Secondary
the problem of exactly, right, and alienation. Like they're not, as like was Lacan says in the mirror stage essay, like they're not born prematurely like us, like And Taylor Atkins mentions this too in the Machinic Unconscious podcast on instincts and their vicissitudes. How like even Freud realizes like animals have instincts, but we have drives. And a bird develops how to fly and as it hatches or after it hatches, all these other things that are optimum quickly, but a baby, right, is poor and defenseless, right? It doesn't know to eat until the mother is right there to grab it and put their mouth into the breast, and then a drive is activated. But if like a baby somehow got out of the house, like just crawled in the middle of the street and saw a car, it wouldn't know like, oh shit, I should probably run away or whatever. It's defenseless. There's this like lack or this non-attunement to what we could call instincts for us.
Hence the necessity of secondary narcissism.
Right. Yeah. The alienation.
And a little bit later, he'll talk about the idea of the human as mechanism, but in contradistinction with a more old-fashioned notion of what the machine is. And he very beautifully illustrates what the heart of the distinction really is in this idea of the jam machine. But I don't want to get the animal as jam machine, but I don't want to get too far ahead.
Yeah, I mean, it comes up in like pages 30 and 31, I think.
Here he says something really interesting about causality and this finalist conception that is sort of germinal within a certain notion of causality. This is a teleological understanding of causality, and it speaks to exactly what you were just saying, I think, about evolutionary science and what he's talking about with hexagons and patterns in nature, and how we can't attribute a sort of teleology to these patterns, however much they lend themselves to our structures of understanding, which those structures are based on the kind of narcissism that we're talking about.
And one thing to point out, I'm glad you pointed out on this critique of like causality and finality. We have to look at the background of anthropology and its upbringing, and I really like how like in Baudrillard points this out in criticism of anthropology prior to like structuralism. In what is it, the Production of the Sign, the last book that he wrote, where he kind of like splits from Marxism, but that and everybody else could avow for this, that the beginnings of anthropology were based on this like Enlightenment notion, and that other tribes were just primitive, and that they were slowly evolving, and their religions were just based on totems or fetishisms, and that they need like kind of like the guidance of those who understand Christianity and are of like a more advanced society to help on their upbringing. So that's why like you see a lot of like anthropology back in the day, and even like Engels is guilty of this too, falling into stage theory of anthropology, like, oh, this is like like this stage right here, and then now they're in this stage, and they'll slowly develop it right into the stage that we're in.
No, that's a really interesting observation. Isn't it also funny that a concomitant of that is also this notion of the noble savage, the Rousseauian notion, where it's like on the one hand, we denigrate these people as primitive, as closer to nature and the animalistic and the kind of like mechanistic notion of animals than us, but us as enlightened Westerners, like Dutch royalty or whatever we are in this scenario. Yet at the same time, they're more pure-hearted, right?
Yes, right. Especially it's like, oh, the ailments of society, and that how rational thinking has just got us away from our animal instinct, like the whole idea of romanticism, right? And then like you pointed out, like the noble savage, like we have to touch on our irrational instincts that make us, want to go out and run in a forest naked or touch dirt or grass. I remember reading this poem. It was a romanticist poem in my senior year, where it's like this dude is literally naked and he's just like describing about like how like he just wants to like be absorbed in the earth's wet dirt as it's raining and just like covering himself. I'm just like, what the hell?
Yeah, you want to do that as long as you know you have a shower,
Yeah,
a
right.
bath, plumbing to go home to, and then
Right.
it's great. But
Then we'll
without
go to the
that,
7-Eleven and get a 40 afterwards.
yeah, exactly. So Lacan says something kind of controversial here, which is that there is no biological basis for the practice of exogamy versus endogamy, pretty much saying that, I guess, I don't know how he's defining endogamy if not as a form of incest, and that incest wouldn't necessarily lead to hereditary defects.
Mhm.
I don't know if he's making a truly scientific claim here or this is just one of his classic provocations, but I think the important thing to take from this is the notion that you can't explain away the incest taboo as merely a horror of the biological consequences of inbreeding.
Right, right. Yeah. And the main thing is this is where he's building up this whole understanding of like um contingency versus universality in Levi Strauss. And that again, it's like the primacy of structural kinship is what allows for something to be granted or prohibited. But even in this prohibition, makes the thing that's prohibited more of a problem, right? It's like, oh, if we make weed, weed is now a Schedule 1 narcotic. Well, then now people are becoming more criminals because of weed. It's like its own prohibition becomes its own like demise, pretty much.
Right. And the symbolic functions according to the things that it proscribes,
Mm-hmm.
in a sense,
And
the
yeah,
practices and the actions that it proscribes. But what's interesting, I remember D&G point this out, it's like it's just an ideal order. It doesn't mean that in all of these societies the prohibitions are actually followed and obeyed
yeah,
at every
right.
turn. It's an ideal that emerges. That's another interesting thing. It's like an ideal that emerges from the study of the practices and behaviors of certain societies, but it doesn't mean that people follow it to a T. There's no perfectly functioning system.
Yeah.
I don't
I
know if
think
that's
it. I
exactly
think it's
relevant.
also. I think it's also funny because I know you mentioned it about like earlier when we were talking about like kinships and stuff. It's like, well, in the prohibition of the incest, right? You don't know like that your mother is supposed to be or your sister is supposed to be somebody that you're not supposed to fuck until it's established as a negative in that. It's like, the primacy is like your mother is not your caregiver and the one who gives birth with you. It's your mother is that and the one that you shouldn't sleep with. And your sister is also your sibling, but and the one that you shouldn't. So it's already the negative and the prohibitions are already inscribed with
Yeah,
the
yeah,
identity
yeah,
and distinction.
exactly.
Yeah.
And it's ambiguous too. That's the fascinating thing about the name of the father or the no of the father, right? Is it
Right,
has a
right.
biunivocal function, and that like you have the proscription of a certain desire that
Mm-hmm.
actually in effect names the desire. Oh, that's what I was desiring all along. D&G don't like this at all, but that's what I was desiring all along, the desire of the mother. So the desire of the mother only becomes named when the no of the father comes into it. But what's interesting, the
Right.
no of the father also works in a different way in that it prohibits the mother from reintegrating the fetus too. So it's also a no for the mother. You may not reintegrate your offspring.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what's
Right.
really, really fascinating about it. And of course, again, DNG are not going to like any of this because it to them, at least the form of Lacanianism that would make this a article of gospel
Mm-hmm.
is for them totally counterproductive to anything that would lead to any political change. But that's getting a little far afield of what we're doing here. But why do you think he keeps talking about the numerical and numbers and like the number of elements that constitute a symbolic universe exactly? Do you have any idea? I'm not sure.
It's a little confusing for me, so I'm definitely gonna take the L on that. But if I had to give like an educated guess, I think it's just because of the fact it's like, we go from like, wait, I think he does mention this in like one of the in seminar one towards the end when we start to understand the symbolic function or small order, in relation to like speech and stuff. But it's no longer just the mediation of a third, right? There's this constant like reproduction, right, of like certain inputs and outputs of the symbolic order. And I think the whole thing about numbers is the fact it's like, well, we should see like numbers. And I think this is this whole thing about like sets and his whole thing about mappings is like they serve as like a reproductive function. And I think he probably takes us up in this whole, because right here, like in this entire seminar, he's not just like, kind of flirting with anthropology and breaking away from phenomenology. He's actually also flirting with a lot of cybernetics. So I think right here you get a little dose of that with this whole thing about numbers and their production, right? This whole cybernetic.
Combinatory or how
Yeah, yeah,
combinatory,
exactly.
however you say, yeah.
Different combinations of how these elementary structures can form, right? And changing the conditions and the possibility for something of where prohibitions are in this way and what is granted is in this way,
Right,
right?
which makes a lot of sense because it's like if you could divest the symbolic of anything contingent, what's the poem that we read at the end of seminar one, the Angelus Silesius poem about
Oh yeah.
basically the contingent falls away and we're left with the essence. The
Yeah.
essence isn't the flavor of a thing, it's the opposite, right? It's that which dialectically speaking has no content, and to reduce something to the numerical would be to, yeah, in a sense, strip away like bark from a tree all of the contingencies of it. So he's not interested in necessarily, well, what does this tribe define as uncle versus aunt
Right.
versus this tribe? It's like all of those contingencies don't mean shit really
Yeah.
for
Until
him,
they're producing a function.
because it's like even the unconscious later, is it the purloined letter where he reduces it to the combinatory of the sets of dice rolls,
Right.
for
And then the odds and
example,
evens, right?
the odds and evens, and it's like, what the fuck is this when you first read that and you're like, oh, I kind of get it, because it's we can't look at the unconscious as a storehouse of contents of they're it's down there, it's in the
Yeah.
basement, and there are all these images and faces and energies, and uh, this might be what DNG are kind of missing to
Right.
my mind, because it's like that he was never, Lacan at least, I don't know about Freud, but Lacan never really portrayed the unconscious as theatrical in my opinion.
Exactly. And I think like for looking at like the Oedipus complex and the incest problem, it's like it's not something literal, right? Because it wasn't like, oh, in your development, you want to, desire your mother and it's the father that's prohibiting you. It's the fact of the way I wouldn't call it kinship, but the family institution is set up and the way that it symbolically structures us as we go into the clinic, right? And as we're working through and we get closer to the unconscious, especially in the dreams, we see desire structuring itself in a theatrical myth of Oedipus, not to say that he wanted to fuck your mother, but rather that there is a displacement of desire that's put onto the symbols of mother and father to play out an adversary of prohibition and desire, right? And it's like Oedipus can't be reduced down to that. It's the fact it's like the Oedipus complex and the paternal function and rivalry could manifest itself in that certain scenario, but it's not limited to just the paternal and the mother, right? And I think that's what D&G kind of miss, because it's a retroactivity, right?
Right,
It's
right.
a development thing that not just psychoanalytic theorists like post-Freudians get wrong,
Yeah.
but in Kleinian's object relations knows, but even like, normies that are just like, yeah, Freud was kind of an interesting man, but loved his mother way too much, thinking that we were born
Yeah,
to
yeah.
like, it's like, oh, it's a retroactive thing that when you start to understand the patient's desire and how it formulates in dreams, this could be a combination that comes out and seems to be like deliberately coming out, especially in bourgeois society in Freud's time, because there was this, prudence going on. There was a lot of rivalry with, families, because let's face it, bourgeois, they have money, they're bored, so they rival with each other, they bicker with each other. And the fact is like there was some like affairs going on with the mistresses or the governess and all these
Oh
things.
yeah.
Yeah,
All the
so
time.
it's like you see this in the repetition in bourgeois patients that Freud was dealing with, where it's like, oh, the Oedipal myth. It's not reducible to that. It's just one combination of how desire could play out retroactively in creating the Oedipus drama.
No, I love that. I love everything
Yeah.
you just said there. That was
That's my bar for the day.
perfect. Yeah, that's a clip right there. But yeah, where are we? I just want to make a timestamp here. Cool. But yeah, you're helping me to sort of sketch out Lacan's understanding of the Oedipus complex. Retroactivity really is the crux of it. And I
Right.
realize that because what I think Jung and D&G get wrong, but for completely different reasons, is, well, we can start with Jung. It's like, okay, because there are these patterns within the structures of people's pathologies within a certain society, we can
Right.
distill from that a general mythological architecture of that society, and then from there find what are the common features of all mythological architectures. Whereas with D&G, they're saying, no, you're implanting Oedipus the moment you talk about it, and we need to get away from the pathogen of Oedipus,
Right.
which you're injecting into your patient's bloodstream, which I think they are correct to the extent that in the bourgeois society, different bourgeois societies, because you have Victorian and then modern
Yeah.
modernist society of Lacan, there is your prototypical bourgeois figure and your prototypical bourgeois analyst who is doing that. In a sense, he is Oedipalizing his patient.
Yes.
But in what Lacan is considering true analysis, it's like the retroactivity of it isn't supposed to point to this underlying pathogenic reality which is inescapable.
Yeah.
And the culturally informed aspect of Oedipus is something that only happens retroactively. And there is a pattern that emerges in that the Oedipal, let's say, mise en scene or narrative structuration that goes into this analysis of one's desire and one's family dynamics, there are going to be very common themes within, especially if you belong to a certain class, come from a certain level of privilege, have similar aspirations to other people in your class. But that doesn't mean that there's anything essential or eternal about that underlying quote unquote archetypal reality. What happens is the true analysis actually, as you pointed out, is trying to point out the displacement onto the Oedipal triangle.
Right,
That,
right.
especially for those who are familiar, who know something about Freud, who have heard of Oedipus, who are slightly educated, and a lot of the vast majority of analyzans that Lacan and Freud are dealing with are highly educated people who are coming to their sessions with all of these, not Freud so much because he just pioneered it, but even for Freud, it's like he's publishing books. And we know from the last seminar, he had a patient who had read his book on jokes and is already trying to incorporate his metapsychology into her treatment as a sort of form of resistance.
Yeah.
And what I'm getting at is that, like, you're Lacan, on the one hand, I think is also pointing to the fact that you're going to encounter patients who have this education and come with certain prejudices and presuppositions. And Zizek talks about this. He has a really funny anecdote about how some analyst he knew, was dealing with a patient who presented all of their disclosures as, exemplifying certain central Freudian concepts, right? So he's like, the patient is saying, well, maybe this is desire from my mother. Maybe I want to have sex with my mother. And the way that the analyst dealt with that was, instead of being like, exactly, that is your desire, was like, what are you talking about? That's disgusting. What is wrong with you? You're sick, like, so you turn it around on him. But that just goes to show you, I'm kind of like getting off
No, that's good.
from the main thread, but like, it's not about reducing things to Oedipus. It's about how I like the way you put it, how Oedipus is in itself a displacement.
Yeah, and it's like, it's a way of structuring like a quilting point, in a sense, to where there's something of a desire, which is not in the fact that like you wanted your mother and you hated your father, but rather that you're using these images and the discourse and structure of what they are representing to represent your desire, right? Because it all falls into a representation of desire. And you're right, like in even in Jung, he gets this wrong too. And like with Jung, like his dismissal of Oedipus makes him more Oedipalized because he creates complexes: the mother complex, the father complex, the only daughter complex, the devouring mother. You have the puer, the return of the child. So it's like a child that's in pure innocence, or just like somebody who just has this pure innocence of a childlike manner, can never grow up, like the Peter Pan phase. That's literally so Oedipalized right there.
Right.
Yeah.
I just thought of a meme. You see that the meme where it's like Moe from The Simpsons throwing Barney out of the bar, and then he's behind him. It's
Right,
like
right.
Jung throwing out the Oedipus complex, and it comes back as Peter Pan mother complex, or whatever.
Yes.
Pure puer mother. It's like,
Right,
yeah, all you
right.
did was just break it down to its constituent parts. You didn't get rid of it.
That's dank. That's dank.
I might have to make that one.
Yes.
Well, we shitting on Jung. We like Jung. Uh, cool, 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 cool. All right, we already kind of talked about this. He like shits on the collective unconscious, why Jung is wrong. He says it makes a kind of, I like this, para animal formation. It imagines a symbolic function as this informing humanity as a kind of large animal. That's not what we're dealing with, because if the symbolic function functions, we are inside of it, and we are so far into it that we can't get out of it. What I really liked was this line here, and I liked it because I found it difficult. I had to read this a few times, but I think it's worth highlighting. He says, a large part of the problems which confront us when we try to scientificate, that is to say, to bring order to a certain number of phenomena, first in line being those of life, in the end, it is always the paths of the symbolic function which lead us much more than any sort of direct apprehension.
Right.
That's really interesting. It's always the paths of the symbolic function which lead us, not this sort of direct apprehension. This reminds me of what he was talking about in the last lecture with episteme or episteme.
Right. Yes. Yes.
Where, and the status of knowledge, and that like we imagine with knowledge that we are gaining a direct apprehension of something. When we know something, we think of it as like a eureka moment.
Yeah.
Which those, in my experience, don't exactly happen as they did for Archimedes in that fashion, but that's sort of how we imagine, in a cultural sense, what it means to learn and know something. You have this direct, almost Delphic apprehension of something in the moment. Not to say that doesn't happen, but in those moments, you are not perceiving the entire formal, coherent body
Yes. Yeah.
of
Yeah.
a certain form of knowledge. And that's this idea that you can't really get outside of the symbolic in that way. All of the scientific, supposedly objective pathways which one grooves into the surface of a body of knowledge in its exploration are still symbolically informed, because ultimately, well, if we make a scientific discovery, ideally we could reduce it to a number of numerical elements. We can bring it to the level of a calculus, and let's say that's what Bertrand Russell was trying to do with logic, with formal logic, bring it down to its most formal level to achieve something that like Descartes believed would be the ultimate aim of a true philosophy, which it would aspire to the incontrovertibility of mathematics. That was never achieved. And the attempt to do it is kind of laughable. But here's the thing, with scientific discoveries, that can be done in a sense. And yet, we still attempt to explain most scientific discoveries in everyday language.
Right.
Not
Right.
everyday language necessarily. Obviously, there is a quote unquote technical language, but use of metaphor is made. And
Exactly. Yeah.
That's what I got from this.
No, like I think that, and it's like there's never really like this coherency of the totality of the system. Rather, it just seems like what you did was, and I might be more like postmodernist about it, but like it really just, you found a new interpretation. You like through a discourse and the set of arrangements and orders in which something called knowledge can be discussed. Right? It's not like a new achievement. Like I transcended the the limitations. I'm closer to the thing being discovered. Right? This kind of like paranoid knowledge of like, not that the truth is out there, but it's like it's waiting for me to discover it and master it type thing.
Right. And as we, often talk about, it's like the intervention that is foreclosed.
Yeah.
The active intervention that is foreclosed in the discovery. And this is where the creative function of speech comes in. It's like speech literally can change reality. Just as a perfect interpretation given at the right moment can alter one symptom.
Yeah.
And then he gets into his famous distinction between a kind of mechanism, a conception of mechanism, that he believes cybernetics is on the path to realizing, that is nascent
Mm-hmm.
in its earliest stages, and he contrasts it with a anachronistic idea of the machine. And
Right.
it's interesting because it's sort of like this palimpsest of ideas and structures, notions that are left over from another era. And I'm just spitballing here, but it makes me think of how a Marxian idea of structural changes over time mean that really the shift from feudalism to mercantilism to early industrial capitalism to modern capitalism, it's like there are always features
Mm-hmm.
of those systems retained. So whereas we associate capitalism with a kind of like emancipation, slavery has always existed as an institution under capitalism, and in one form or another exists today, although we
Mm-hmm.
just don't call it that. Now that's going a little far away from like what the thread of what we're talking about here, but it does make me think of like one of the things he's saying when he's like, you have to anticipate how something will be seen a century from now, is that you sort of you have to understand in this almost retroactive way, in the sense of like future anterior, what will have been,
Yeah.
what elements of a certain worldview, a predominant definition, a cultural norm, what elements of them will be seen as outmoded or
Mm-hmm.
anachronistic in the future. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, I understand what you're getting at. I think like also too to show like even like some of like who Marxists like fell into this like uh finalistic fatalistic thing with the stages like primitive society to and again because they take the origins of the family and the private property from angles like to heart, so like they fall victim to stage theory and it's funny, very vitalist in a sense of like this progressing forward, striving forward towards socialism, uh but mainly like it's developmental, which is totally the opposite of like dialectical, right? There's no aspect of overdetermination. There's no aspect of the split and like really that these contradictions don't resolve out, that there are then sublated forward in a different manner in capitalism and create an antagonism that comes about from not being able to repress it or reconcile it, and it comes back in an overdetermined, exasperated form. Um, so I think another thing that's interesting to kind of tie it back into, and I brought it up for a reason, the term vitalism.
Yeah, he says vitalism.
Yeah,
Sure.
because like when you look at both the and D&G try to reconcile this too. They, if you notice in Anti-Oedipus, they say the whole school of thought of a battle between vitalism and mechanism, right? Both of them have, in a sense, this kind of finalistic view, right? Vitalism more towards like Elan Vital from Bergson, and kind of grounded in a more biological thing, right? Trying to ground it in some aspect of nature. And then you have mechanism, which if you look back, for instance, like the deists, right? Most of those, like our founding fathers are like Thomas Paine, right? These deist thinkers were mechanistic in a like a linear causal faction where it's like if there was a creator, right, then it was like the watchmaker. He set everything into motion to go. like a factory operates, right? Like a machine, all you just need to do is pull that lever, and then everything will go, and it will obtain its goal, right? Where now we're thinking of cybernetics. It's like it goes beyond that, because cybernetics deals with a lot of inputs and outputs and different codes and combinations, where even if there's a breakdown, a new short circuit could come about to create a new combination or a new input and output for a total function, a different function of a machine that has nothing to do with a certain goal, but rather it operates on its functionality in conditions. It's contingency for the most part, but it's a multiplicity of different inputs and outputs.
And we're talking about a kind of radical contingency that is precluded in the theory of vitalism and precluded in the theory of mechanism.
Yeah,
That's
in cybernetics, right?
Like those two are often opposed as like the only games in town or vitalism or mechanism, and it's like vitalism. Right. There's a matter has a purpose and a spirit that is realizing itself through matter towards something. Mechanism is okay. It's
Newtonian type of
machine. It is a self-sufficient perpetual motion device that just needs a god to wind it up. Either way, there is a sense of perfection and purpose.
Yes,
yes. Systems which aren't as opposed as they might appear. One just has a, like you said, a kind of linear, causal, factual direction. The other one is just more like a centrifuge, almost, I would say. But cybernetics, as you're explaining it to me now, which I really don't know much about cybernetics, maybe we could get Draco on because I know he's cybernetics, is a third thing which has to do with like a radical kind of contingency based on chance short circuits.
Yeah, right? and different types of like inputs and outputs. And so, they also have feedback, so there's this retroactivity towards it too. Feedback loops, all these other things, right?
Fire.
Yeah.
L'homme machine. So he says it a lot more simply and eloquently than I was, that you can't imagine the extent to which they were so caught up in these categories of an earlier age. And I really like this idea because it definitely throws a few things into question here. One, the sort of like ossified doctrine of psychoanalysis or ego psychology in its many distorted forms that he's trying to counter with his own elaborations on Freud's theories, but also this idea that we might have of so-called primitive or elementary kinship structures. And to jettison these ideas is also to, as I was mentioning before, sort of understand from a point of view, theoretical point of view, in the future, which categories will be considered archaic by the time we've reached, I shudder to say another stage, but a different point in history. Yeah. And then he says, and then it's interesting because he focuses on the word amour, and it's one of his sharp left turns. Because you're like, what does that have to do with mechanism exactly?
Yeah.
But you would say that his understanding of mechanism is more informed by cybernetics, right?
Yeah, like, and he's playing off of what he means by that. Like, or like, just like, he's playing off of like his going beyond the distinction of like classical vitalism and classical mechanism.
Should we take a break at this point, or do you want to?
Think so, yeah. Yeah, we could take a break.
All right, so 10 minutes. Um, I like how 2 starts out here. Has anyone still got a question to ask? It's like, ask it now, motherfucker. Because the only bold people in these dialogues, of course, are Benoni. Benoni is the most bold, I would say.
Yeah. Hippolyte has like small like remarks. He's not as conversive in this one, but he's always doing like those small statements. But like Manoni's just got like paragraphs for days, like
But
that
Benoni's
toxic,
like
yeah, that
Birdman
toxic
hand
ex that
rub.
sends you, yeah, that sends you that long ass paragraph message. You know you're fucked up. And then Hippolyte's just like K, just the K.
Benoni is just like, I find it funny how ... and then just like, I just find it funny how. Now, good for Benoni standing up to Lacan here. And I found out, I didn't realize Benoni wrote about colonialism. That was one
Right,
of
yeah.
his areas of focus. So his questions make sense. I would say these are some of the best questions and some of the best clarifications made by anyone in any of these seminars so far. So good for him. I like this example you uses of these mollusks of the helical variety. Sometimes they have a helix that is swirling to the left, sometimes to the right.
Right, yeah.
Coiled one way or the other. What are we to make of this? And he somehow brings up the notion of nature versus the institution, which seems a little surprising following his example of mollusks and their shapes, but it makes sense because we're talking about contingency. So he says that, we have a conventionalism that gets confused with the symbolic, not the same thing, and how there is a kind of pseudo natural or pseudo cultural, somewhere on the line of pseudo natural, pseudo cultural choice that we imagine from, I think, a kind of what you were talking about earlier, like a liberal worldview. We imagine that there's a choice that's made at some point when it comes to family structure or power dynamics in society.
Exactly. Or like
as if
how
we
people
sat down and like blueprinted it out,
Right. People, it's just like, or like what people's like liberal like what is cliche thing is like, if we just had younger people in office, or if we just had like better, more competent people, then everything would run more efficient. As if it boils down to either like people are incompetent or they're just too damn old, and if we just had younger people, like they would listen to like the hearts and the voices of the Americans, or just like in any capitalist like nation, like of the people. It's like, yeah, because that's all it boils down to, because the younger people have our best interest, right? No, it's definitely structured on class. It's definitely structured on maintaining the modes of production. In this case, we're talking about kinship, but overall it's structural, and it has nothing to do with this like abstract concept of the human that stands outside the margin of the structural network.
Right. And I think retroactivity also plays into it here, in that we cannot but imagine this atemporal mythic moment of the birth of the symbolic, and all conversations about the origins of language, which Lacan justly points out are always ill-informed and ill-advised.
Right.
always rest on this assumption of this pre-linguistic,
Exactly. Yeah.
pre-symbolic reality, which can only portray man as the human
Right.
individual, as someone without features, someone who's has these latent abilities and propensities that would
Mm-hmm.
lead to a symbolic evolution, but
Right.
is only a negative form.
Yeah, and
Lacan is going to he is going to talk about a kind of negative form, but it's not that, you know.
Mhm. And I think it's also interesting because if you like, we're looking on the broad spectrum, and I hate to use the term macrocosm, but if we bring it down to the microcosmic level, or like at least to the patient, right? There is no like libido that stands outside of the symbolic order, right? Of a person, like the libido investment, it's already thrown into language. The person is already thrown into language. So that means that their drives or libido are structured in drives from the get-go in some way or shape, form, or another. And this is the whole thing that we're grappling with using the optical schema, about like how we're not just this abstract I, and that we're always placing ourselves to look at the bouquet and the vase in some like certain aspect to change the way that we see ourselves, and we see the symbolic order, or the mapping of like the area that we're in. It works the same way. So you like to even try to even think that you're an abstract I, or just somebody that like is this individual that stands outside the margins of whatever discourse or of the society, can only do so retroactively, or can only do so in the position that allows you that, right?
Yeah, it reminds me of the notion of the homo sacer, I think
Yeah.
it's pronounced,
Homo
that
sacer, right?
yeah, I don't know, sacer, sacer, it's Latin, right? But it is an idea that Zizek takes up, and he elaborates on it, I think, in Parallax View. I know it's an idea that Agamben, I think,
Mm-hmm.
came up
Mm-hmm.
with, but Zizek said something really interesting, which is the ideal beneficiaries of the notion of human rights must, by definition, be individuals who are dehumanized and in some ways precluded from being able to attain those rights. Meaning, it's like, in order for us to even conceive of what human rights are, we have to imagine someone who is almost defined as subhuman. And
Mm-hmm.
let's say Zizek's example would be like a slum dweller or something, who is completely debarred from what, and this is pejorative now, would be like first world amenities and privileges. And in a sense, it's like the problem with the liberal worldview and its focus on just human rights is that it allows for the persistence of this concept of the extra human, subhuman
Yeah.
individual, there, because there needs to be this like as yet unconquered territory of human rights in order for us to keep celebrities who have their pet cause that they're focused on. They need that, those pet causes generate the ideal
Right.
like recipient of rights yet to come. And
Mm-hmm.
that's the problem with the idea of enjoyment politically. And just to bring it back to what Lacan's talking about here, the idea of the homo sacer as well, I think another definition that Zizek toys with is this idea of like someone who's legally dead.
Mm.
Talks about terrorists under the Bush administration being considered legally dead between two deaths in a
Yeah.
sense, but that doesn't directly relate to what we're talking about here. But again, this negative model of an individual, but it's a disavowed sort of negativity. It's seen as like existing at the very inception point of humanity, but at the same time, it doesn't actually have any contingent realities once you like shine a light on it.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a strange paradox there. Does that make any sense?
Yeah,
A
no,
little
that's
bit
yeah.
all over the place, but
I really like how you brought up that mention of like legally dead. It's like you're in between two deaths.
yeah, because you're outside of the symbolic order in some sense,
Mm-hmm.
just like
Yeah.
Antigone, in by adhering to a certain ethical truth that she feels like transcends the immediate symbolic order. She effectively like upholds the symbolic order, but she's excommunicated from it as
Right.
a
Yes.
consequence. What does
Kind of
that to
like
do with this? I don't know.
look. You think Lacan was in between two deaths when they kicked him out of the society of
Yeah, yeah,
justice, and the Marxists were like, "Come this way."
absolutely. No, I think that's really good. Yeah, much like all the best thinkers and creatives are exiled at one point or another.
Yeah.
Dante, Joyce, Lacan.
Yeah. That's why he came up with like he was so like good at coming up with an elaborate concept of the real in Seminar 11 because he was in between two deaths.
Yep. Do you think if I was gonna make a really lame joke? Never mind. I'll hold on. I'll hold on to that one. All right. So we're talking about like contingency as opposed to the idea of necessity. Is there
Mhm.
any necessity to these helical shapes being twisted in one way or
Right.
another? He brings in the necessity of mathematics, for instance. Is that the same variety of necessity as what we witness in the symmetries and asymmetries of reality? Lacan would say no, because we need to distinguish the universal from the generic. They're not the same
Yes.
thing. The generic has more to do with the conventionalism
Right, right.
that Manoni is talking about. But of course, the shapes, left-handedness, right-handedness isn't a convention either. It
Hmm.
so I don't know. Help me out here to like distinguish like what I'm talking about here. The things that exist on the border of culture and
I,
nature.
I think in the fact it's like obviously we have two hands, right? But the fact of like now I think what he's trying to say is like the fact that we have two hands, right? It's definitely part of our genetic makeup, right? It's the biological fact. But I think in nature's combination, it doesn't necessarily have to be the case, like that we are featherless bipeds, right? But that just happens to be the thing. And then the whole thing about right-handedness, it's versus left-handedness, then it's like nature being captured and marked by the socius, right? The markings of the body of we should be right-handed, especially like I think like when you look at like in the occult and stuff like that, like in religious things, it's like left-handed was considered like blasphemy or heresy. It's considered the devil, right?
Sinister comes from the word
Sinister.
left.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Sinister, right? That's perfect. But like you can see like in that sense, like I say it's more like the fact it's like there is like we could conceive of the natural, right? But at the same time, with not it having to also have the contingency in the markings of a culture or symbolic order, the socius and how DNG would put it. but like this instance of the markings of the body is like how I like to think of it as, right?
Well, what's interesting is that like if you find any number of like science bro articles about why are more people right-handed than
Right,
left-handed, they would be trying to bypass exactly what we're talking about, a
right,
culturally charged conventionalism in favor of the direct apprehension that he was referring to before. But there is a
right.
surreptitious exercise going on where we are still following these symbolic pathways, but creating the semblance of a direct apprehension of something known, of knowledge beyond the
Exactly.
symbolic. As if, well, like if you look at early hominids, they were
Yeah,
often cutting down trees with their left hands and with early tools, like whatever, you know.
yeah, like and or like freaking experimental psychology simps like talking about if we leave like uh a bowl like or like a tray of like cash right here. Let's see like in this crowd of people like if people will actually go up to it and steal it or would they just like walk by? And this would prove like are we innately selfish? Like this whole like
Are we wired? You know, people say, I guess
are
I'm
we
just
wired?
wired that way.
Yes.
And it's, I hate that expression because it's like, oh, well, sorry, that's a nice excuse. Can I use
it,
that
it
for
made me
all
think
the
of
terrible things
the
I do?
It made me think of the Patrick Bateman meme that people are using. It's like a reel. It's like him and then like William Dafoe. And he's just like, oh, and he's like, I'm just wired that way. You know what I'm talking about?
Exactly. Exactly. That's a good one. That's so it, but the idea is that it contingency and necessity, and that it's not that Lacan is saying, no, we have pure free will and agency in everything we do. No, but it kind of has to do with the ethics of
Yeah,
psychoanalysis, that like you have to take up what is unconscious. Let's say left-handedness is a kind of choice, or right-handedness is a kind of choice in the same way sexuation is, but it would be seen as an unconscious choice, which is paradoxical in that
right.
it isn't something we experience as a free choice, but we are still responsible for this choice as a choice, even if we didn't, in the conventional sense, choose it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well said. That was good.
Boom. Uh, so this is what it was talking about before. It's a pseudo nature, right?
Yeah, yeah.
One encounters the family in the same way one encounters the oak or the birch, as if these pseudo natures were a result of human liberty or of contingent choices. But I like that Manoni also says, I don't have a solution. This is just a difficulty for
Mm-hmm.
me. Hippolyte
Homie.
intervenes here to be like, I'm not going to admit to my own
Yeah.
vexation here, and I'm gonna like add like a little clarification on some Hegelian shit. You know me, but he brings universality into it. Um, what what is universality in this context? Well, Lacan is going to distinguish between two senses of the word formal, right? There's the mathematical sense, a whole series of consequences of theorems which follow from one another, and then the gestaltist sense. The good form is a totality, but it is actualized and isolated. Now, I don't know why, but I feel like maybe this is kind of Aristotelian almost. Does that make sense? That's what comes to mind.
Yeah, okay. I kind of see it because of an isolated form. Yeah, the good form. Oh yeah, yeah. That's definitely like very much like Aristotelian or like even Platonic.
Only as like a turn away from Plato, where the form's always in here in matter itself and the structure, the way substances
Mm-hmm.
are organized along the lines of genus and species, but never isolated.
That's Aristotle actually that says
Yeah,
that.
that's what I'm saying. Yeah. actualized and isolated, though, which sounds almost kind of contradictory, but he's saying it's not this latter notion.
Yeah.
It's not this Aristotelian
Yeah.
ideal. He's talking about
First.
a combinatory
Yeah.
sorts, a cybernetics of form.
Yeah.
But then we get into this idea of like totality. And Iblitzo, oh, okay, so the symbolic universe is purely conventional, but that's not quite it, because the symbol in itself is empty.
Yes.
This is something we talk about a lot. The symbol in itself is empty. We have natural asymmetries in nature, but at some point, a little bit, he's going to say it just is what it is.
Yeah.
And that should be accepted, because he says what natural philosophy endeavors to discover in some way always leads to an impasse or a blind alley, let's say, because once you're focusing on these contingencies, you cannot from them distill an essence. As per Angelus Silesius,
Yes.
the
Right.
contingencies need to fall away, but you cannot draw from them. You cannot just gather all of the contingencies together and in that kind of, Chomsky like way, distill an essence or a structure from that.
Right. From just those particular contingencies. And like right here, like I think this is where he makes the thing is like the problem that Strauss was facing was like, he saw something close to like the symbolic order of like what Lacan was talking, but he didn't have I think he didn't have like the right like language for it, or just maybe he's just like afraid that, like he says right here, he's gonna fall into this transcendentalism of the nature of the symbolic order, in which it pretty much is just the new God. It's just a new theism, or like the new like signifier of God, like of a transcendental essence.
Which Levi Strauss is wary of.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't want his system to be misunderstood such that we show God out of one door and bring him back in under the guise of what exactly this sort of an essence of formal principle. And what's interesting about that is that it always comes with a value judgment. It's always value laden one way or another when you try to, in some ways, shape a principle from contingency, even if it is through a scientific worldview seen as value neutral. That's possible. So I think that's why he talks about God here, in that there's that sort of the finality to it, if that makes any sense. I don't know.
Yes, yeah. No, I think I get what you're saying. It's a little kind of hard to like decipher like exactly like what like maybe not Lacan, but like at least Lacan's interpretation of Strauss. But I will say like with that, it reminds me of when he's saying about like just reintroducing Gotti and like the whole Moses like meme that you mentioned. It's like Levi Strauss trying not to be like that.
Dude, how did I not put that together?
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. See, you wonder how the memes are made. This is how. Doing it right now.
We literally just read the seminar so we could find good memes in here.
That's all it is. We are just meme hunters.
But I think one thing right here, like he wants to, like, it's cool that he mentions, like in contingency, right? We don't want to live it to like Pavlov bros, where it's like, oh, it's just institutions, right? Institutions are just contingencies, they're of a particular contingency, right? But it's not like overall the contingency of like the entire symbolic order.
Well, this is what the lobster bros do, though, too,
Yeah.
right? In that it's
Right,
a
right,
naturalization of institutions.
right.
And of course, that's your go to argument
The dominance hierarchy, right?
when it comes to capitalism and why the hierarchies as they exist under a capitalist regime should be that way. It's a naturalization. So that's what happens when you let God in out of the other door under this mask,
Yeah.
pretty much, is that you sort of, you sanction everything. You sanction the status quo in some
Yeah.
ways, I think, is like, not that that's the point Lacan's making right now, but that's just what I'm getting from it.
Mm.
But it's, we haven't talked about psychoanalysis in a
Right,
while,
right.
I realize. So um in regards to the creative function of speech and what analysis is um striving to address,
Mm-hmm.
what do
And I
you
think
think?
the reason
What are you
why we
thinking?
let this like built up to this is like because he wants to really get away from this like biologizing of what psychoanalysis has been doing for a while in post-Freudian and other school of thoughts, right? And showing the contingency of a lot of the things, but it's not any way, shape, or form reducible to like a sort of social constructivism, right?
Right. And it's funny because right when we realized that we haven't talked about the analytic experience in a while, he brings it up here. And suddenly he's talking about transference again.
Yeah, right. Because it's something that is, we could say that we're transferring every day, but why is it that the transference has something of a significance in the analytic situation, right? So you could say that there's a contingency to it. But insofar as like the setting for the transfer or of analysis makes it contingent enough for transfers to take place, doesn't mean it's always going to happen, because you don't necessarily transfer for a while with like a patient that's like you're really hard to get at, especially like one, like it was believed that psychotics by Freud weren't analyzable, or somebody who's really narcissistic and self-absorbed was not analyzable because of the transference. It just needed to take time, like I guess you could say certain ways of combination of speech. And that it is not necessarily the case that they're going to transform, but it is still contingent to a certain set of possibilities. But you don't see like the transference of the symbol or the real or objet necessarily in day-to-day living like you would in analysis. But it also makes me think if like maybe in a sense we do when it comes to more of like things that really represent our object cause of desire. And thus I think when we bring Zizek into it, the analyzing of the commodity kind of shows that it aligns with objet, and the analyst sense has the objet, right? It has the das Ding, or the desire, right?
But I want to take what you're saying back to this idea of analyzing either the psychotic or the narcissist, which theoretically are two psychic personae which cannot transfer, and therefore they can't give you anything by way of symbolic relation.
Right. Well, so according to
Right.
like Freud, at least, like they weren't, but no, we realized that they are. And obviously other analysts have worked with patients like that, and there is a transference. But the thing is like the technicality of the transference in the psychotics is that they have no metaphorization. So in a sense, it's like during working through the process and the transference, and working through the unconscious, right? Because the unconscious is foreclosed. There is this moment where they literally take their, pathologies to be on the level of the analyst. If you look like, for instance, the story that D&G talk about in Anti-Oedipus of like somebody who's probably schizophrenic or psychotic, but really believes that the analyst is the cop recording his
Right.
his thing,
Yeah.
right. And so he's like, no, you're a cop. Like, watch, I'm gonna start recording you right now.
Well, he
And then like
calls the cops.
yeah, oh yeah, so
Or
like
he threatens to call the cops. He's like, "Oh, you want to call daddy then? Like,
yeah,
go
yeah,
on, go call."
that's right. Because like no, the dude had a cassette tape,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
then that's when the analyst was like, "I'm gonna call the cops." So it justified like, oh, you really are a cop. So like literally like the literalization, not metaphorization of the transference could act up in ways like that with a psychotic.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Because the metaphorization, that they're creating metaphors all the time, but those metaphors have consequences in the real for them.
Mm-hmm.
Right. When you say in that, not well, you can't call them metaphors though, because the metaphor
No.
always involves repression. There's no
Right. Yes.
metaphor without repression, but it's kind of an attempt almost to
I think so.
repress
Yeah.
where one can't.
Right. Because at least you're trying to bring in some neurotic discourse to allow them to create metaphors. I could be wrong about that, but
Yeah, I
that's
don't.
just further research into the clinical structure of psychoses.
I want to wrap this up, but I do want to just like relate what we're talking about back to universality. I just want to tie them together, but I'm having a difficult time. The mark of systematic universality has been imprinted by the symbolic relation. So we have like the universal, the symbolic, and then like the conventional or generic.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm trying to think all of those together in one way. And then transference. If the
Mm-hmm.
transference reveals one's symbolic attachments or the specific style of one's
Right.
dynamical, like sort of attachment to family members, the other,
Right.
essentially,
And
then
maybe
like
we could
what does that do? What does it have to do with universality? Though?
right. So let me put a perspective. Look at what psychoanalysis is doing now with like people like Garavici and all that, where they're really introducing the problems of like colonialism and indigenous persecution and the trauma and the death drive that goes along the lines in these patients, right? It's not like this thing is a universal phenomenon, right? It's definitely contingent, but it's still affecting them, right? Not everybody suffers from colonial oppression, right? But they are out there, and it does affect it. And these combinations or these this sort of discourse of the other in the colonized subject or in the like oppressed indigenous people from the global south come about in the transference when they're under analysis, but these are no way something that is universalized. And I mean, capitalism is universalizing itself, so there's going to be some particular discourses that are contingent or maybe even generic in that sense. That kind of bringing it into perspective.
Yeah. So if you're dealing with someone who has suffered directly under the a colonial regime, for example, that should be taken into account even with the transference,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And that,
yes,
but that, so that,
and I think it's cool that like Lacan touches on like this style. I think because this is what allows analysis to, in a sense, bring the clinic an overall social phenomenon, right? And take these things
wait, but
as
what's universal rather than contingent though about the transference though? That's what I'm trying to understand.
So the fact is that, like, so long as we have consciousness, right? So long as we have subjectivity, we're always going to mirror, right? And especially like if we spoke two different languages, right? Those are contingent. But there is always this agreement or gestures that we come into contact with one another, that allows for any type of intersubjectivity, right? Unconscious agreement, unconscious discourse. Um, and but the transference in the clinic is something that is contingent to the setting of the analysis, right? Because, like I said before, it's not necessarily the case that somebody's going to transfer, right? You may not ever transfer with your analyst. Like, look at homie with Ballant. Like, he had many analysts, but he couldn't transfer onto them, or they were like bullshitting him. And finally, he talks to the homie Ballant, and he's just like, yeah, I don't know what you're saying. Like, I can't make anything out of it. There, he finally transferred because it's like, finally, you're the first analyst who's never gave me like a bullshit lie, or like, humored me. And analysis started right there, because it's like, then it told something about his desire, at least. Or it didn't say something about desire, but it allowed access into the symbol, or would be we get the objet art, or das Ding al Gamma, right? The analyst discourse by the hysteric. But that moment of transference is, we could say it as transference becomes a tool, and something that at least analysis is trying to universalize as far as technique, right? The primary technique of understanding the discourse of the unconscious. But it is not necessarily the case that you will always, or the patient will always transfer, because it takes time, right? And the analysis doesn't start as soon as your patient goes inside, the session. Sometimes the analyst or the analysand will transfer onto the analyst when they have their like first like orientation phone call to set up their first appointment. They can happen right there, right? You
Right.
look at like, yeah.
No, go ahead. Sorry.
I was gonna say, look at like, maybe there was a transference on Freud by the person that was trying to bring the theory of jokes, and like right when she read the work and wanted to seek out Freud, right? There's this hysterical demand being placed on him from the get-go. I would even think in the Wolf man himself, because he used to read a lot of Freud, and then like the works that he published, and then went to him. So I think maybe there was transference right away, but it's still in the relation between the analyst and the analysand. You see the transference in which the unconscious discourse and the resistances of the real come about, right?
Is the transference always a demand?
Yeah, it's the transference love. Yeah, it's always like, at least like you get to realize like the demand of, the unconscious discourse. But I feel like the demand happens when the ego misrecognizes like, love and desire for demand. I think, could be wrong on that one.
But I like this idea that the transference always involves some kind of demand, and that maybe there's a universality in demand, in the discourse itself being the discourse of the other is universal. And it makes me wonder, though, with like these, let's say, colonized subjects that Geravici is dealing with, do you think it's necessary to have undergone a similar experience, to have survived similar forms of repression in the social sense,
No, I don't
to
think so. I don't think so, because then right there, then
be
you
a
get into like
transferential
this.
figure for the analysand? Because that would be overly contingent, right? It's like, let's say you as the analyst for the analysand resembled in some sense their image of the oppressor, or
Right.
they feel that way, then that can be productive in the kind of transference that comes from that, wouldn't you say? Or is that
Well,
going too far? I don't know. I'm just
no, that would be like an ego psychology, bro, right there. Because like in some cases, you don't. It's important that like analysts take this type of shit seriously. Like when it comes to like political discourse having an effect on, the relation of the patient. But it need not be the case that the analysts themselves have been through similar shit, right? They could be politically active in their day-to-day life, especially if they're taking this type of discourse seriously in psychoanalytic theory, but they don't necessarily have to have gone through similar experiences of effects of imperialism, colonialism, war from like a third world nation. Because like if an analysan goes to one that has experienced the same things, then they want somebody that could become the little other, and they're appealing on the level of affects, and they would want not saying they want, but this will be the case that the analyst ends up counter transferring onto them, right? We're like the same. I want an analyst that really gets me. I want an analyst that we share similar qualities.
right. And then if that is the case, in terms of a two body psychology, then
Right.
there is no concept of transference, nothing but a multiplicity of facts tied together by a vague and inconsistent bond.
Mm-hmm.
Because we need a radical stand on the function of speech,
Right.
which doesn't attach any sort of denotative purpose to signifiers, but views signifiers in their pure materiality.
Yeah. And I think it's also interesting to note that too, is like, the problem of transference as a concept and a method, because it's like something that you can't prove on a scientific level, and like data bros, like,
Yeah. Yeah.
like something like, I wouldn't say like empirical, but like, observational, like on the scientific discourse level. It's something totally different, right? And a lot of people, like in other realms of psychology, experimental psychology, dismiss psychoanalysis on the basis of like all the transference, like that's some pseudoscience stuff, right? It's like you're only observing their behaviors and like their body language and stuff like that. But the transference deals with something totally different, right? It's a totally different thing of like analyzing like the traces of speech or of the discourse that's going on in the unconscious, and also how the transference, once done, also takes place in the realm of dreams as well, or not realm, it shouldn't be Jungian like that, but in the level of dreams, right? Especially like when the analyst is involved in your dream, then that's how the transference is really hard too. Like hard as in like more concrete, not like hard to do, but there is transference.
You're saying that's the strongest.
Yeah, because then you're getting into this like transference love, so it's like the symbolization of love onto the analyst, right?
Sick. All right, we'll try to wrap this up here. Getting into the pleasure principle,
Right.
back to our three planes: symbolic, the imaginary, the real. He's still all about the ego as an imaginary function. We'll see it more in its symbolic valence as we progress through. Wouldn't you say, or am I wrong about that?
Sorry, say that again.
Progress through the seminars, we see also like the ego more in its symbolic function, or
right. Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Right now, it is very imaginary, though, for Lacan. And we're going to talk about the lure.
The lure, yup.
Is this where he, is this where he talks about animals and
I think we,
mechanism, or do we skip that?
I think we kind of went already past that. That was like a few pages back, but
shit.
That's all good. I mean, we kind of already brought it up anyway, like in our conversation. So
Well, maybe we should just touch on that really
I
quickly.
think is it right? I want to say maybe it is right here.
The animal as a jammed machine. That should be here. Well, if not, we can
Yeah.
talk about in that like the animal is jammed at the level of primary narcissism.
Yeah, at least
In that it's fully locked in with the lures that define the
right.
pathways of its activity.
Mhm.
We are something decomposed, he says, and
Yeah.
possess greater freedom in that we're taken in by lures, but the lure is ourself. The lure is our own or ego informed or ego driven image, and we are always seeking this. Later it'll become object A in the multiplicity of images that we form of ourselves for the purpose of bodily containment and
Yeah.
motor functioning essentially. uh yeah, we're driven by libido, and we're going to get more into this with
right. At the end of the on page
beyond the
37
pleasure
is
principle.
where we get more into like the distinction of the ego. And right here, um right when you talk about like towards like section 3 or the section 3 on page 37, like with the structuring of our experience, he talks about like, they have a gestalt link, which is part of the imaginary, right? The perception and the understanding or misrecognition, as you would call it, because it's a in misrecognized form of who we are, and that the ego is an other, right? But it's an other that is inverted, or again, to repeat myself, reconnaissance, misrecognition. But in the structuration of the ego symbolic order, right? There's already what he calls like a crack, or like a profound
Right.
of the regulation of life, which I thought was pretty interesting. And this crack is, at least he'll start to call it, like in seminar 11, like the gap between the unconscious and, the ego, like the gap in the subject is where we locate, the real.
Right. And wouldn't you say that it is this crack, this profound perturbation that basically elevates us above the jammed machine?
Right, right. Yeah.
In a sense, because again, the lures that define the different the way animal activity is directed are make it a jam machine that pretty much animals can only do one thing, to put it in very crude terms, but it's
Right.
like eating and procreating. They can't desire,
Right.
so to speak. What separates us, of course, is desire, but desire isn't something that leads to like a human perfectibility, but quite the opposite. It's what goes wrong in the machine.
Yeah.
What goes wrong in the machine is the thing that makes it a machine, strangely enough, and that's that no machine can account for its own activity,
Exactly.
essentially. But when you were talking about cybernetics and the short circuit, it's the short circuits in the machine that make it truly a mechanism rather than a jammed machine. And this
right,
is
because like there's circuits of like a circuits of enjoyment. It's like it's not the fact that we just enjoy one thing, but we create a circuit and a pathway of like how we want to obtain enjoyment, but like how we want to desire and enjoy being desired. I mean, that's what he talks about, like, circuits of jouissance, or at least I think that's more of Zizek's thing. But like, there's an overall system in which desire, flows, like the the lacked object, or jouissance will create itself, right?
Yeah, you know what's funny about it? It's like what he says about this fascination. Lacan says in Seminar One, this fascination people have with babies and small animals, in that both babies and small animals appear to be entirely enveloped in their own enjoyment, or maybe enjoyment's not the word, but narcissism, let's say. They're purely enveloped in their own narcissism, and that they don't seem to be desiring beings in the proper sense of the, manque tre, or how
Yeah.
you say that, or the pilot, or like the speaking being. And it's like, it's, if you watch a squirrel, it's like, I always think, like, what do you, when I watch this, like, what do you want? Like, what are you looking for? Que voy? Like, what
Yeah.
I know you want food and you want to procreate or whatever, but like, there's something so enigmatic about a
Right.
desireless being, because it's like, yeah, well, que voy?
What do
It's
you,
like what I
yeah.
keep thinking of,
Yeah.
and there's
It's
no
like,
answer to that
what do you
question.
want? Yeah. When they just stand there and they look at you, especially on the tree, like a tree, you just see them like staring at you, but then as soon as you move, then they run away and they run up the tree.
Just nervous, jittery, playing dead. They're
Yeah.
so determined to get at something, but they have no conception of what an object
Right.
is. And to conceive of an object is to have an object cause of desire.
Yeah.
It, I would need, we'd need like some ethologists or something to correct us, because, or maybe some PETA people would have words for.
No, well, animals have rights apparently, right? They're speaking beings that can represent themselves.
Yeah, let's focus on people living in slums first, I would say, but then we could. Uh, no offense, animal lovers, we
Yeah,
love
we're not trying to start giving social security cards out to these stray cats and
a voice for the children. Uh, so he talks about beyond the pleasure principle a little bit, but it's pretty much an appetizer, right? This is
But
what
this
we're
is
getting into.
yeah, and this is where you were kind of like what you it was yesterday, right? Where we were talking about like
Dualism. Yes, I wanted
dualism.
you to elaborate on this, like the dualism between what ego drives and libido drives. Is that the dualism, or?
Right. Yes, that's the dualism because it's like, you know, Lacan thinks that there's only like one drive, right? The death drive, and that well, what makes the libido different from the ego if the libido is already invested into the spectacular image, the ego, right? And it's this libido would seem like as this invested uh, image and pre-eatable. But even that being said, it's like if you're already thrown into symbolic order, there's no pure libido. Libido is going to be marked by the socius. It's going to be marked by a discourse, and somehow you can think of it like in the way of like the prisoners are already thrown in, and we only know about the prisoners and the warden in the logical time. But with that being said, it's like maybe they don't have the development of an I yet. But like for instance, I'm always gonna go back to like the homie little dick or the wolf child. It's like especially with the wolf child, like the wolf child, all he had was one word. Like he didn't have an ego investment, right? Any attempts of mirroring always led to aggressivity and some type of I think maybe they called it like anal sadism or whatever. But with that being said, like he has some type of admission to the symbolic with just the fact of one word, but he's not exercising symbolic order of speech, right?
And
But
then,
what I'm trying to get at is like there's really no such thing as an ego before or like a libido that exists outside of like the ego.
right. Yeah, then no, that's a fascinating thing. Zizek talks about this in Sex and the Failed Absolute, of the libido basically being the solution to continuity between nature and culture. but you can't think of it as having anything but a dialectical negative
Right, right,
reality,
right.
in that it can only be conceived of from the point of view of the symbolic order as that which eludes it, but it being a kind of undead germplasm, which I realize that Lacan uses that phrase and takes it from Beyond the Pleasure Principle, when
Mhm.
Freud is trying to figure out what in the human organism is, or organisms
Right.
themselves is immortal. It's like this kind of germplasm, this undead thing. It it is nothing in itself. It can only be viewed as such from the
Yes.
perspective of a being integrated into the symbolic order.
Right. And I think this beyond the pleasure principle even shocked Freud to even like rehab, like having to rethink his two drive theory, because it's like when you look at Freud of on our narcissism and transference love and the three essays on sexuality, this Freud was dealing with like, he was thinking of libido as situated in the biological aspect, right? And obviously trieb is something totally different. It has nothing to do with instinct. But that libido aims for satisfaction, and in the finding of the object, then libido has an object of satisfaction, not even just of itself, but an object that it would be satisfied by. Then with the narcissism, it's the libidinal investment of the ego image. So then it's like not only do you have libido on the drive for sexual satisfaction, but also a satisfaction of sexuality sublimated onto an idealization or realization of an image, right? And so that's what he was dealing with, and seeing that on the basis that, in a sense, narcissism is trying to actualize the not only the satisfaction of its image, but the love of its image, and the dealing, the coping of never getting loved or to be loved, not even to love, but to be loved.
Mm.
And it always fails to love itself or desire itself, because of course it does need that recognition. And in the transference, that's what he was dealing with. And he always says, like, so in order to not fall ill, we must love, you know.
But the
And the
failure to love
narcissist, yeah, the
is
narcissist,
the satisfaction of the drive, though.
right? Yeah, and narcissists, like for him, it's like this failure to love, right? And but again, there is still this. I could be wrong, but for at least early Freud, or no, this is more like middle Freud, but like Freud of this time thought that there was some drive in the ego because of that was different from libido. But then you see that when he discovers the death drive, totally different, right? This whole undermining, right? That's like undermining of one's like ability to not only achieve satisfaction, but even the fact that they know that they're not satisfied. Even in war trauma patients, the compulsion to repeat that goes beyond, the pleasure and satisfaction of the ego and libido drives.
Nice, nice.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, almost finished here, but I think this is interesting. This little exchange here. Hippolyte's getting a little testy, but he's saying, I don't understand why we even need to be talking about this symbolic function if we can't get out of it and we can't remain in it. What purpose does it serve? And then Lacan says, well, if you want to stick by what you're giving me now on the phenomenological plane, I have no objection. Only I believe it is insufficient. I wonder what he
yeah,
means by this. Like, is he saying, you're demanding from me something phenomenological, and like, you can't, that's not what I'm offering you, because that is not how this symbolic function should be
yeah.
understood.
Right.
phenomenologically, which
And-
I kind of get, because that's the thing. It's like when you read this stuff, there is this temptation to want to interpret what he's saying phenomenologically, and he's influenced by phenomenology, but none of this explains the direct apprehension of reality. We're not talking about the like unmediated view
right. Yeah.
of one's attunement in the Heideggerian sense to
And I
the
think
world around them.
Yeah, and I think also because of the fact it's like when he's saying, well, already in the symbolic order and we can't escape it, like, can't we just like observe it in a phenomenological sense or describe it? And he's like, no, you're missing the entire point. Like, he's like, I have no objection if you want to like talk about it on a phenomenological sense, but it would only lead you so far to retract back to like an imaginary understanding of what you're dealing with and focusing on, gestalt, immediacy of the experiences, and always relating to the body, your position,
Right.
understand, relating like uh, some generalizations or overall understanding and knowledge of something.
Right. It's like an episteme,
Right, right, right.
and that's what Heidegger, for all of his genius, is limited by. Maybe the presentation of an episteme doesn't, in his attempts to try to kind of get beyond, but also bring to its logical conclusion, Kantianism.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like he still posits this margin of uncharted territory that could reinstate the thing in itself
Yeah,
in some sense. But it's like, just because you're focusing on the details of everyday immersion in reality doesn't mean that you get beyond the kind of inherent transcendentalism. And I think like that's what phenomenology leads to. But Hippolyte, being a philosopher, wants to be situated in
yeah,
this sense. And it's like he's missing the point of what Lacan's doing, which is trying to train analysts.
right. At one point, Hippolyte is lacking right here.
Yeah.
Usually Hippolyte's on point.
Yeah, because maybe he's like intimidated by Benoni, because he's used to being the main interlocutor here,
Right.
the,
Yeah.
the
And that's
one
the
who
thing is Hippolyte,
staricizes him.
right. Hippolyte is just a philosopher. He's not an analyst, but Benoni is.
Well, he's an analyst, but also like a theoretician in his own right.
Yeah, but Hippolyte is not a psychoanalytic like analyst, or he's just kind of curious about the theory and obviously friends with Lacan. He's the Hegel guy.
He's the Hegel guy, which, being a good Hegelian, he should be following
Mm-hmm.
what's going on here and not fall into the trap of like getting back to some kind of thing in itself.
Right, right. Or the
Which I
things
don't know if
themselves.
he's doing that. I might just be putting that. I might be projecting onto Hippolyte, but I like his name. That's a sick name.
Yeah, it is Jean Hippolyte.
Um, cool. So just to wrap up, asymmetry in nature is neither symmetrical nor asymmetrical. It is what it is. As
Right.
Popeye says, I am what I am. Same as, one thing that God and Popeye have in common is they both say, I am what I am. When God's a burning bush, he says, I am what I am. Popeye is what he is. And then we're going to get into, oh, wait, I love this though. This I thought
Yeah.
was brilliant. I don't want this to escape us.
Yeah.
Um, one makes use of the ego in the same way as the Bororo does the parrot. The Bororo says, I am a parrot. We say, I am me, moi. None of that has the slightest importance. Here's the genius of Lacan. It's like in 3 sentences, he just like beautifully summed up and essentialized everything he's getting at, which makes perfect sense.
Right.
So it's like, I love that because it's taking us back to the idea of the unsophisticated, primitive, cultural understanding of oneself, which is sort of identification with a totem animal. And we find that baffling and naive and childlike. But he's saying it's like, if you relate yourself to a parrot as an object, as an identity, it's not any different from saying I am me.
Yeah.
Moi is also an object that just because it doesn't have, just because it's not an animal, it's no more or less a misrecognition.
Exactly. Yes. Yes.
It's
Yes.
still a misrecognition. And the contingencies of being a parrot or a me, a moi, are relevant to analysis. So long as one metaphorizes themselves in this way, I am blank.
Blank. Yeah.
You are, reminds me of this great moment in Ulysses in the Nausicaa chapter where Leopold Bloom writes in the sand, he writes, I am a, and he like stops there, which is like his attempt to understand what he is and metaphorize himself. And it's sort of like, that is the level of, well, what would you call it? Like just the basis of like a subjectivation and the impossibility of the impossibility of what is awry in the symbolic order being set aright.
Yeah.
in a sense, because it's like the lack in the symbolic order is that which cannot be assimilated and metabolized in it, but also makes the symbolic order possible.
Yes. Yes.
But we are not parrots, and we're not
parrots.
the eyes of science. I think that's about it. Apologize everyone for all these diatribes. I am very caffeinated. I'm trying to replace booze in these conversations with caffeine, and we'll find out if it works any better, but I think that's a wrap.
Yeah.
What do you say?
Yep, I call it a wrap. I'm pretty caffeinated. Well, I had some caffeine earlier. Now I'm just drinking water, but caffeination minus the beer does something a little different.
That it does. All right, I'm gonna stop recording.